coffee with God? Of course, Hebrews. And that's what we want to take a look at, this book called Hebrews. So, imagine ourselves having coffee with God. I think that's the best thing that we could ever do, is imagining ourselves having a conversation with God. And honestly, though, if we're going to imagine ourselves having a conversation with God, it's probably better for us to imagine us letting God do the talking, and let God do the talking the way He wants to do the talking. And let's indeed get the story straight. So let's do a 40 together. Come on in. Let's hear what God has to say about getting you a proper priest in Hebrews chapter 7. Biblical channel. We are so glad you're here. It's just fun to be people who talk with God with one another. And I promise you, the only thing I ever have in mind is helping people to hear that conversation that God is having with all of us in a way that brings our life into a better sense of connectivity with God. We always have to remember that the normal way that God speaks is through the Bible, and Christians ought to know the Bible and hear from the Bible and talk about the Bible in a fairly regular manner, just like this, and imagining ourselves having that coffee with God. So we're not going to read the text today because it's another long one. We'll read it as we go. So let us do what we ought to do. Pray the way Jesus taught us how to pray. Our Father in heaven, love you. Hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That never gets old. I love it. It's the best prayer ever. Thank you, Jesus, for that prayer. And that's who we are coming here to see, because that's who God would like to talk about. Whenever we have coffee, we talk about family, and of course God is going to talk about family. He's going to talk about us becoming family, but before we can become family, we've got to understand the family of God, especially the Son of God. So that is where we are going to go in this conversation, but we're also going to be talking about priests. So in talking about priests, the name Melchizedek has come up already a couple times, and we've had to say something about Melchizedek. But we get the sense that the author here would really like to talk about Melchizedek, so it's no surprise that chapter 7 is going to be all about Melchizedek. He's going to expand upon Melchizedek and explain the significance of Melchizedek, and so we need to come into this conversation because, hey, God likes Melchizedek. You know, Melchizedek's a God guy, and God brought Melchizedek into his storyline, so we ought to know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. But the other thing that I think about whenever I think about diving into Melchizedek is I remember that quote by somebody smart who said, if you can't grasp 3,000 years of history, then you're living hand to mouth. And the picture that this guy gives, and this is a guy who said this like 300-400 years ago, but in saying that, his point is pretty simple, and that is we have the opportunity to grasp 3,000 history, but if we don't, we're going to be living hand to mouth, and living hand to mouth is really like living like an animal, that we're really just living from one food feeding to the next. You know, we're living paycheck to paycheck. We have nothing in the savings account. We don't know where our next meal is going to come. And if that's how we're living, we're going to be very vulnerable. If we don't have, our savings account built up, and I just know this, if you're a young person and you don't have a savings account, like when I was a young person and you didn't have a savings account, then you totally know that there's a lot of anxiety in living day to day, week to week, et cetera, because you're always on the verge of running out of money. Well, our human tank, our human savings account is really based on history. that you come into this world as a sapien, as a human being capable of imagined reality. And because you have this powerful imagined reality, the Bible calls this being made in the image of God, by the way, but other people just call it having this power of imagined reality or a conscience. Well, in order to secure that conscience with a big savings account, to secure the rest of your life so that you're not living, your life in a paycheck to paycheck manner, that you would actually, be familiar with yourself as a human being in the context of a massive amount of history, that the more history we know, the better we actually feel, the more secure we actually feel. And there's a trick to this, because at the beginning, people hate history because it seems, it seems confrontational. It seems daunting. It seems like there's too much to try to wrap our heads around. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But I will tell you this, young people especially, the sooner you get involved in knowing history, the more, comfortable you'll be in your own skin, because you'll see how you are connected with a long lineage of human beings that are trying to figure things out, making lots of mistakes along the way, but trying to figure things out. And being a student of history helps you to build on successes of the past so that you don't make the same mistakes of the past. It's just that simple. I don't think history repeats itself, because the players are always different. But there are certain things that we can learn to help advance ourselves in our lives. And believe it or not, the Bible stands as the place that has always tried to bring that kind of security to people's life by bringing the security of a long-term history into your knowledge base, into your recognition. And part of your knowledge base involves other peoples from other cultures and other places, and that should not make you feel insecure. But when you understand what they're doing and how what you're doing is similar to what others have done, and really what you need is to do it in a way that makes the most amount of sense possible, you start to feel a lot better about yourself. No matter what goes wrong in your life, you start to feel, that you are in perspective, that you have things in perspective. History gives us perspective, and successful people are people who have perspective. A big perspective. And I think history makes you humble. And I think one of the best qualities we can have is humility. And knowing history in a real way definitely brings you to your knees in humility. And again, realizing that, wow, I'm pretty small in this thing. But even though you're small, as a human being, as a sapien, you think big. You want to think big. You want to think eternally. You want to find that connection eternally, and so does God. God wants you to find it. He does not want to play cat and mouse with you. He wants you to find the big story. He wants you to be connected to a story that reaches into the beginning as far back as humans can go and reaches out to the end to let you know what the future is all about. And so that is how the Bible works. It serves as this continual development of God, bringing more information about himself and you to the table so that you could grasp not 3,000 years of history, but we're going to grasp 4,000 years of history right here, right now in Hebrews chapter 7. So without any further ado, let's do it. Let's just dive into this. This particular chapter does not involve a very complicated literary structure. It really is straightforward. It's simple. It's a storyline that kind of goes back and forth with explaining the significance of, the person and the character of Melchizedek in God's story. And you definitely had the impression that the author wanted to talk about this, and has already made it clear that it's that part of the trouble with the audience, even for him 2,000 years ago, and we assume it's a him, but the author has trouble here because the audience, much like our audience today, says things like, "Well, I'm bored with history. I don't know history. I don't care about history. History doesn't matter." That kind of thing. And he's saying this is why we can't feed you solid food. And when it comes to biblical solid food, it's not some sort of mysterious spiritualism or this mysterious ritual or some secret passcode or some sort of higher level of meditation. It's really about your knowledge base expanding and seeing how history itself has been moving forward to the place where you are, and the things that have gone on before you are very significant. Some of them are extremely significant, and the Bible wants you to be able to digest more than just milk, just the simple little things. It wants you to be able to expand your mind in a historical context, to know what God has been doing from the beginning up to now and into the future. So God in the Bible is wanting people to grow up with knowledge, good knowledge that will actually build upon your successful life. Okay, enough said. We're going to dive into it. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 1 down to verse 3 goes like this. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. And then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. All right, there's a lot of concepts in here that need a little bit of explaining, and I just mean a little bit of explaining. And I think that the first thing I need you to at least be aware of, and maybe this would be a good homework assignment, is go ahead and read Genesis chapter 13 and 14. Because in Genesis chapter 14 at the end, that's where this Melchizedek business, comes about. This mysterious man from out of nowhere, who has a name and, that means, righteousness and peace. He has a function of being a king and a priest from a place called Salem. We assume that's the modern day Jerusalem, but these are before those days. So maybe it was just called Salem then. But Salem means peace. So in Genesis chapter 13, that is just one chapter away from when you meet Abraham. And when you meet Abraham, the striking part of the story is that God has chosen Abraham to reveal himself to, and has asked Abraham to leave his mother and father and go to the land that he has promised. But more significantly, he's promised more than just something to Abraham. He has promised something to all of humanity, and that is to bring a blessing to all of humanity through what he's going to do with Abraham. So read Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3 to see that God's game plan with Abraham is to bless all nations and to bless all peoples and all families. Okay? Now, in 13, we find out that it's not just Abram and his wife. He's got this entourage. We tend to imagine Abram and his wife as just these kind of lone nomads who just kind of dilly-dally around out in the middle of nowhere doing, nothing but twiddling their thumbs, waiting for God to show up next, and they bumble around and they get into, some different troubles, and it's a fun story. But I think that if you're like me, you always think of Abraham as this kind of solo nomad guy. Nope. It turns out that Abram had a pretty huge following, and it becomes very clear that he has a huge following whenever we find out that he has 318 men that can fight, and they get caught up in a battle of the kings that, we'll hold that thought for a second. But part of Abram's original entourage also involved his nephew Lot. And many of you know some of the Lot stories, but we find out that Abram and Lot seem to have so many people between the two of them that they think it's best to probably split up and go their separate ways, since the land's so beautiful that, there's plenty of room for them. And they just agree to settle in different places. And it's probably necessary because they both have quite large entourages of livestock and people and tents, okay? So they've split up. And chapter 14 then kind of goes into this, random story about how the area to the north of them gets caught up in this huge battle of the kings for 12 years or more. And this battle of kings, the kings are listed in here, and this battle of this kings keep going on and on and on until one day the battle of the kings to the north of where Abram is, and it engulfs Lot, his nephew, and his entourage. And what happens is that Abram is told, hey, from somebody who escaped this, comes down, who knows Abram, who knows his fighting men, and says, hey, just so you know, your nephew Lot has been captured in this battle of the kings that's been going on. Abram says, oh my, okay, well, we better get involved here. And so Abram assembles his 318 fighting men and jumps into the fracas, and lo and behold, well, Abram helps the one side that defeat the other side, and in defeating the other side, he gets his nephew back, and and then it's in this post-victory moment that we meet the mystery man Melchizedek, who steps onto the scene and, steps onto the scene as a king and as a priest. And he recognizes Abram's greatness because Abram has the promise of God to bring a blessing to the world. And so we get this encounter between Abram and Melchizedek, where Melchizedek blesses Abram because he's the man of promise. And then Abram turns around and pays tithes to this Melchizedek as a priest, who's also a king. So I just thought that would be important, to kind of see where the author is going, because the author says, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. Okay, so the author finds it very significant that this man, Melchizedek, comes out for the sole reason to bless Abram. He's a man of promise. But I think there's something very significant for us here, and that is that this guy is no regular run-of-the-mill guy. Somehow this guy comes out of nowhere, and he recognizes the greatness of Abraham because of one thing. Abraham has been given the promises of God. And so this man, this mystery man, his very name means righteousness. His name means peace. This righteousness of peace comes to Abram to bless him. Okay? And this man comes out of nowhere. He doesn't have a genealogy, we're told. And doesn't seem like he has, because he doesn't have a genealogy, it doesn't seem like he has a beginning or an end, because we find out nothing more about him from his beginning to his end. But he does resemble the Son of God, and he continues as a priest forever. Let me tell you what I think is significant about this. Some people have wondered if this Melchizedek wasn't, an image, like Jesus himself prior to the incarnation, coming into the scene. I don't think that's true. I don't think it gets you into a lot of trouble if you think that, but I don't think that's what's going on, because there's too much earthly king business going on here, earthly people business going on here, to not assume that this guy is an earthly person who did die, who was born. We just don't know anything about him, and he comes outside the storyline. Remember that the Bible operates from the very beginning of Genesis to where we are here in Genesis 14 on the basis of lineages and that there's a storyline that's going through a particular lineage. So the storyline goes through, Adam and Eve, of course, but then the storyline goes through Seth, and then the storyline goes through Noah, and then the storyline goes through Shem, and then the storyline eventually is going to go through now Abraham. And there's nothing good about Abraham, but the stories following this genealogy that we're told about, and what the author finds very significant about Melchizedek is that he's outside of the storyline, and he's a great guy. He actually resembles a son of God because he recognizes the greatness of Abraham's promise. The promise that God had made to Abraham is what makes Abraham great and what makes God great. And it's what makes this guy a godly guy. And I think we've got to pause right here because all the smarty pants that, you and I, tend to meet up with, want to wag in our face. Well, what do you do about people outside of, Israel and Christianity? What about them, poor suckers? And here, I think, what we can see is that God clearly has things going outside of Christianity and Israel, etc. That there are clearly people that God is saving outside. But here's the difference. When those people who prior to anything didn't know, anything about the promise of God, when they encounter the promise of God, they're all in. See, Melchizedek may not have known about the promise of God, but when he met Abraham and he knew about the promise of God, that's what he bowed to, and he becomes part of the biblical storyline as a great man. He resembles a son of God. That's a good title. You want that title if, you want God to say, you resemble a son of God. Yeah. Well, Melchizedek is told that is, he resembles the Son of God because he responds appropriately to the promises of God that Abraham has. He doesn't try to change it and take it away and say, well, I'm great on my own. He says, no. Your greatness, Abraham, is that promise that God has given through you to bless all of the nations, etc. So that's what's really cool about Melchizedek is that I think we can, kind of ease up and understand that it's very possible that God, has a lot of things going on outside of Christianity, but as soon as they meet the biblical Christian promise that goes the whole way back to Abraham, they don't argue with it. They say, yeah, I'm in. That's what I almost knew would happen. And I've spoken to a lot of people who became Christians, and myself included in this, that, when I heard the proper gospel of God through the promise given to Abraham, on into Israel, on up to Jesus Christ, I was one who said, yeah, that's the one that makes sense. That's the story that really makes sense of life. That's the story I'm going to hang my hat on because that's the story where I find forgiveness. That's the story where I find reconciliation with God. That's the story where I find a loving God. That's a story where I find that God really is involved in all of history at a very caring and concerned level. Okay, so let's move forward. The author then says, see how great this man was. So he's talking about Melchizedek. He says, see how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of his spoils. And those descendants of Levi who receive a priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have a descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in other cases by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Now, I'm going to be up front. You and I both get into weeds on this conversation really easy. Like, this is hard to kind of straighten out. But it's not that hard. It's just because it's unfamiliar territory for us. And really what the author here is setting up is how the people of Israel do need to understand that the priesthood that God set up through the tribe of Levi, the Levitical priesthood, while it was right to be the priesthood, it was a priesthood that needed a better priesthood. Because we all know that the Levitical priesthood really ended up being quite the disappointment in the storyline. It didn't mean that they didn't serve God's purpose, but it did mean that they were quite the disappointment in not really achieving the purposes or the promises that God was after. No surprise that God would have to intervene and do something far better than the priests of the Levites. And so the author here is just making this, point gently to the, probably more of a Jewish audience, that in the case of Melchizedek, as a priest who blesses Abraham, and as a priest who it is declared continues to live, because that's what Psalm 110 says, and we're going to read that in a moment. But the logic here that the author is giving is that, this priest received tithes from Abraham, and the Levitical priests actually come from Abraham. So in a weird way, the Levitical priesthood that comes from the lineage of Abraham is actually the inferior who is being blessed by the superior, meaning that this Melchizedek priesthood is better than them, because this Melchizedek priesthood understood that Abraham deserved the blessing because he had the promises. The Levitical priesthood did seem to miss the point on the promises to bless the whole entire world, the other nations, the other families, the other peoples. They seem to fail to hit that. And so the storyline that Israel knows is a storyline where they themselves should know that a better priesthood is needed. Let's move on. Chapter 7, verse 11 to verse 14. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than the one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe Moses said nothing about priests. Once again, this isn't necessarily our logic or our set of questions, but it is an important set of questions that he's answering. Number one, what do we do with the Levitical priesthood that was set up by law, by commandment of God? And he gives a very simple answer. He says, if they had achieved perfection, well, then we wouldn't need Melchizedek. They didn't receive perfection. See, that's a nice way of saying they failed the mark. And so consequently, that priesthood needs to come to an end. It's also significant that for the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe from which no one has ever served at the altar. And we all know that the Christ was supposed to come from Judah, which he was, but Judah had nothing to do with priesthood. And if we're ever going to get a priest of godly significance, we're going to need a priest from God himself. Okay, this is the author's logic. May not be your logic, but the author is trying to explain that this priesthood, the Levites, well, honestly, they were set up from the law, but they had to be replaced. There couldn't have been, a priest from the Levites who would be the forever priest for all people of all time, because they had failed. It's just that simple. Melchizedek never failed, and so he serves as the human example. He serves as the human prime example of someone who didn't fail the promises of Abraham. We don't know anything about him. We don't know his beginning. We don't know his end. But we do know he didn't fail. And so it's out of this order of priesthood that God is going to make promises. Okay, now let's jump into chapter 7, verse 15. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is written of him, "You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." That's a quote from Psalm 110. We've covered this before, but Psalm 110 is an absolutely important psalm because Jesus himself quoted this psalm very regularly. In fact, when Jesus wanted to really annoy the audiences around him, he used Psalm 110 to refer to how he himself was fulfilling the role of king and priest. And that Psalm 110 that David himself wrote indicated that a new priesthood out of the order of Melchizedek would be coming to Israel. Now, that's what the author's point is that even though, they are set up by law, that's not the best. What's best is if he was set up for a different reason. And here the author says, what makes Jesus the priest of all priests is the fact that he has the power of an indestructible life. That's code talk for resurrection. What makes Jesus a priest forever is his resurrection. This is why all of the apostles say if you don't have a resurrection of the dead, if you don't understand the significance of that, you have nothing here. And we are to be pitied and fooled if we don't have a resurrection of the dead. If Jesus did not resurrect from the dead, then the whole story falls apart, really. But he did raise from the dead. And a significant connection is that being raised from the dead establishes a priesthood forever. Get it? The other priests of Levi, well, guess what? They were just of bodily descent and they died. And we're going to hear about that in a moment. Jesus is a priest forever because he is resurrected, because he beat death. Let's go on to verse 17, chapter 7, verse 18. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. For the law had made nothing perfect, but on the other hand, a better hope was introduced through which we draw near to God. Again, he's elaborating on that same point. The old priesthood could never get anything done because everybody died. You know what I'm saying? They die. We need a better priest. We need a priest who does not die. And that's exactly who Jesus is. He is one who does not die. Therefore, his sacrifice is a sacrifice of eternal nature. That's the kind of priest that we need. So just because the Levites were set up by commandment, it means nothing. The commandments just reveal our weaknesses. The commandments don't reveal our salvation. The commandments reveal that we need salvation. If you get the 10 Commandments, you know that the 10 Commandments make you say, oh my gosh, I need salvation from God. And that's the point that the author here is making. Let him continue. Chapter 7, verse 20. And it was not without an oath, but those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. This one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. Again, this is a little bit more of a look of Psalm 110. Go read it. But here the author is saying that the Levitical priesthood, they weren't set up based on an oath. They were just set up based on a commandment. And that commandment just said, well, you're part of the Levites, so you got to be part of the priesthood. Well, that's not a very good reason for being a priest. That's why we got away from, some sort of notion that kings and queens should, be of a certain lineage, or an inherited lineage, that just being the son of the king means you're going to be a king. That's garbage. That's junk. But what makes Jesus Christ so significant is that he was made priest based on a sworn oath from God. And Psalm 110 indicates that that's the kind of priest that God is going to bring to bear. And that's the kind of priest, by oath, by God's oath, that we need. So we need a priest who does not die. We need a priest who has been sworn by God to be our priest. That's the significance that all begins in Melchizedek, but now we're clearly just into the Jesus talk. We're talking about Jesus and his significance as to who he is, and who he is. Well, he is, as verse 22 says, he is the guarantor of a better covenant. You see, the prior covenant was just a covenant on law. The covenant of Jesus Christ is a covenant of promise, just like the covenant that was made with Abraham was a covenant of promise, which the author has gone at lengths to show that what we need is what God clearly has promised. If you want to know what God has clearly promised, go to Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3, and then keep moving along in the story to see who is there by God's oath. At this part of the story, Jesus is the only man standing who can say that I am the man of God's oath. And we all know that Jesus is God. So he's got that going for him, which is very nice. Verse 23, the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Once again, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is what guarantees us that Jesus is the man of God's promise. That does away with any and all priests. There is no priests of the past that are going to be able to match up with that. There are no priests in the future, which is very mischievous, even of Christians who, calling themselves priests. It confuses the issue. We should not call anybody priests except Jesus as the great high priest, and then we can call everybody who believes the priesthood of believers under one priest, Jesus Christ. That's the way the New Testament, that's the way Jesus talks, that's the way the apostles talk. The apostles never called themselves priests, except that they were just a priest among other priests, the priesthood of believers. They were nothing special. That's what I love about Christianity, the apostles. They themselves said, we're nothing special. We're not different than you. You're actually better than us because we got so much handed to us. You are going by, just the story that we tell. Consequently, we are told, he is able to save the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Listen, Jesus as a priest can save the uttermost. That word means all corners of the globe. That means north, south, east, and west. That means all the continents, all the oceans, and no matter where you are as a human being, Jesus is the priest that can save you because he's the Word of God. He is the King of God. He is the priest of God. He is the whole package, and he lives forever So as a priest, he is always on your side. He is always making intercessions for you. You can never forget that the beauty of Jesus Christ being the priest, the only priest, is that he always intercedes on your behalf. He's always on your side. I don't care what anybody else has ever told you or whatever you've thought. God is on your side. Come to God. Come to his priest. His priest will save you. That is Jesus Christ. He's the king. He's the priest. He's the prophet. He's everything. And so in verse 26, we round out this passage by hearing, "For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily for his own sins, and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all, whom he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever." Okay, here the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the best news to understand. The story that goes back 2,000 years goes back another 2,000 years, and there's no human history that goes back further than 4,000 years or so. And we do know through human history that we all seem to appreciate the need for a priest to get us between this place and God. And here we are told, you have a perfect priest that God has arranged, because the sacrifice of himself was about forgiving you of any kind of sin. All you need to do is come to this priest. You can be from anywhere. You can be from any color of skin. You can come from any ethnic group. You can come from the uttermost places of the earth. This priest is for you because he's been sworn on oath, and he beat death. He resurrected. He is raised. He goes on living to be your intercessor, to be your priest. He is currently a priest for everybody. That is the logic. And Melchizedek drops away from the conversation that he was that kind of priest that honored and recognized the promises given to Abraham, and Jesus fulfills them. And so he is that perfect expression of that perfect priesthood that we need. There's God's priest for you. And that's where we're going to leave it today. I love being with you, and thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time.